Imagine a world where fame is a mask that anyone can wear if they possess enough audacity. In the early 1990s, the streets of London became the stage for one of the most bizarre impersonation cases in entertainment history. A man walked into exclusive clubs and high-end restaurants, claiming to be one of the most reclusive and celebrated film directors of the 20th century. He promised roles in upcoming blockbusters and ordered expensive bottles of wine on the house. He charmed aspiring actors and seasoned critics alike. The only problem was that this man looked nothing like the famous director he claimed to be. This is the story of a deception that relied entirely on the ignorance of the public regarding the true face of a genius. The director in question was Stanley Kubrick. By the early 90s, Kubrick had achieved a mythical status in the film industry. He was the mastermind behind cinematic masterpieces like 2000 and won A Space Odyssey and The Shining. However, unlike his contemporaries, Kubrick shunned the limelight. He lived in a secluded manor in Hertfordshire and rarely gave interviews or allowed his photograph to be taken. This intense privacy created a vacuum of information. While everyone knew his name, almost no one outside his inner circle knew what he looked like. This anonymity became the perfect loophole for a con artist named Alan Conway to exploit in a way that would eventually baffle the world. London in the early 90s was a vibrant hub of artistic ambition and nightlife. The Soho district was teeming with actors, writers, and producers, all looking for their next big break. Into this atmosphere stepped a man who seemed to hold the keys to the kingdom. He was a middle-aged man with a soft face and a penchant for wearing sweaters that looked vaguely artistic. He spoke with a confidence that commanded attention. When he sat down at a bar and casually mentioned that he was Stanley Kubrick, the room would often go silent. People were desperate to believe that they were in the presence of greatness, and this desperation was the fuel for his charade. Alan Conway was a travel agent by trade, but a manipulator by nature. He had discovered that the name Stanley Kubrick was a magic password that opened doors which were otherwise locked. Conway did not study Kubrick's films in depth, nor did he attempt to mimic the director's actual voice or mannerisms. In fact, Conway had very little knowledge of the technical aspects of filmmaking. When people asked him about cameras or lighting, he would simply wave his hand dismissively and claim that he left those details to his technicians. His performance was not about accuracy. It was about playing the role of an eccentric genius that people expected to see. The con usually began in a public place, where Conway would strike up a conversation with a stranger. He would drop hints about his identity until the other person asked the inevitable question. Once the hook was set, Conway would spin elaborate tales about his next project. He told people he was casting for a new film and that they had the perfect look for a leading role. The excitement of being discovered by Stanley Kubrick blinded his victims to the obvious red flags. They bought him drinks and paid for his dinners, believing that their generosity would be repaid tenfold once they were famous movie stars. One of the most perplexing aspects of this case was the sheer physical difference between the two men. The real Stanley Kubrick had a rugged appearance with a full beard and intense dark eyes. Alan Conway was clean-shaven with a receding hairline and a completely different facial structure. Yet time and time again, people accepted Conway as the director. This phenomenon speaks volumes about the nature of celebrity culture. People saw what they wanted to see. The idea of meeting a legend was so intoxicating that it overrode their critical thinking skills. They filled in the blanks of his appearance with their own expectations of what a director should look like. The deception went beyond free drinks and ego boosts. Conway began to manipulate people into giving him significant amounts of money. He would claim that his wallet had been stolen or that he had temporary cash flow issues due to studio bureaucracy. Victims would lend him cash, expecting to be reimbursed by Warner Brothers the next day. One aspiring singer was so taken in by Conway that he paid for a holiday trip for the Imposter, believing it was a scouting mission for a musical film. The financial damage was real, but the emotional toll on the victims was often far worse when the truth came to light. As the months went on, the stories about the eccentric Stanley Kubrick roaming the streets of London began to circulate. Gossip columns hinted at the director's strange behavior. People whispered about seeing Kubrick in gay bars or arguing with waiters about the bill. These rumors eventually reached the ears of the real Stanley Kubrick's assistant, Anthony Fruin. Fruin was baffled. He knew that Kubrick was hard at work at his estate and had not set foot in a London club in years. The descriptions of the man in the rumors did not match his boss at all. It became clear that someone was using Kubrick's name to wreak havoc. The investigation into the Imposter began quietly. Anthony Fruin started collecting reports from people who had encountered this false Kubrick. The details were often ludicrous. Conway had told some people that he had directed films that were actually made by other directors. He had promised roles in non-existent sequels. Despite the absurdity, the sheer volume of complaints indicated a persistent problem. Warner Brothers' legal department was notified, but catching a man who was a ghost in the system proved difficult. Conway moved quickly and never stayed in one place for too long, making him a slippery target. A pivotal moment occurred when Frank Rich, a prominent theater critic for the New York Times, encountered Conway in a London restaurant. Rich and his companions were thrilled to meet the legendary director. Conway played the part perfectly, acting bored and dismissive, yet intriguing. He invited Rich's group to join him and spun a web of lies about his upcoming projects. Rich was initially captivated, but something felt off. The man's knowledge of his own filmography seemed shaky. Later, when Rich discovered the truth, he wrote a scathing article about the experience, exposing the Imposter to a global audience. The article by Frank Rich blew the lid off the operation. Suddenly, the man who impersonated Stanley Kubrick was news. The media fascination shifted from the reclusive director to the audacious con artist. Journalists began to hunt for Conway, eager to interview the man who had fooled so many. The real Stanley Kubrick was reportedly equal parts amused and horrified by the situation. He could not understand how anyone could mistake this man for him, especially given their lack of physical resemblance. It was a surreal intrusion of farce into the disciplined life of the filmmaker. Despite the exposure, Alan Conway did not immediately stop his activities. He seemed to relish the attention, even if it was negative. The psychology of the imposter is a complex puzzle. For Conway, the act of being someone else provided a thrill that his mundane life as a travel agent could never match. He was addicted to the validation he received when people looked at him with awe. Even when confronted, he would often deny the deception or claim that he was simply conducting a social experiment. His detachment from reality was becoming as profound as the myths surrounding the man he impersonated. The legal consequences for Conway were surprisingly minimal. While he had committed fraud, many of the victims were too embarrassed to press charges. Admitting that they had been duped by such an obvious fake was a humiliation they wanted to avoid. Furthermore, Conway had often phrased his requests for money as loans, making the legal waters murky. He was eventually tracked down to his home, where he lived a modest life, far removed from the glamour he projected. The police warned him, but without a lineup of willing witnesses, it was difficult to prosecute him for a major crime. One of the most tragic elements of this story involves the people who truly believed their lives were about to change. There were actors who quit their day jobs, thinking they had been cast in a Kubrick film. There were writers who spent months working on scripts that Conway had commissioned, only to find out there was no movie. These dreams were crushed in an instant, leaving behind anger and disillusionment. The cruelty of the con lay in the exploitation of hope. Conway fed on the aspirations of creative people, leaving a trail of broken promises in his wake. As the 90s progressed, the real Stanley Kubrick began production on what would be his final film, Eyes Wide Shut. The irony was palpable. While the real director was crafting a complex psychological drama about masks and hidden identities, a fake director was living out a bizarre parody of those themes in the real world. The production of Eyes Wide Shut was shrouded in secrecy, which only helped Conway. Since no one knew what the real Kubrick was doing, it was easy for Conway to invent details without fear of contradiction. Eventually, the law did catch up with Alan Conway, but not for the impersonation itself. He faced legal issues related to other fraudulent activities. His health began to decline, and the energy required to maintain the charade faded. However, he remained unrepentant to the end. In interviews, he would often chuckle about the people he had fooled, framing himself as a misunderstood performance artist rather than a criminal. He died in 1998, just months before the real Stanley Kubrick passed away. Their deaths marked the end of a strange dual existence. The legacy of Alan Conway is a curious footnote in film history. His story was so compelling that it was eventually turned into a film titled Color Me Kubrick, starring John Malkovich. In a final twist of irony, the imposter became the subject of a movie, just as he had always wanted. The film highlighted the absurdity of the situation and the willingness of people to believe in a lie if it is packaged correctly. It serves as a reminder that fame is often a projection of our own desires, rather than a reflection of reality. The case of the Kubrick imposter forces us to examine the concept of identity in the modern age. How much of a person's identity is defined by their name versus their actions? Conway was able to steal the social capital of a famous name and spend it freely. He proved that, in a world obsessed with celebrity, the symbol is often more powerful than the person. The real Kubrick was a man of flesh and blood, but the Kubrick that people met in bars was a fantasy that they were eager to consume. Looking back at the photographs of Alan Conway, it is hard to believe that anyone was fooled. He looks like an ordinary man, completely devoid of the intense aura that surrounded Stanley Kubrick. Yet this ordinariness was his camouflage. No one expects a master of deception to look like a suburban travel agent. He hid in plain sight, protected by the assumption that no one would be brazen enough to tell such a colossal lie. It was a high-wire act performed without a net. The story also sheds light on the isolation of the real Stanley Kubrick. His retreat from the world created the shadow in which Conway could operate. If Kubrick had been a media darling, appearing on talk shows and red carpets, the con would have been impossible. It was the mystery that made the fraud viable. Conway filled the silence that Kubrick had created. In a way, they were two sides of the same coin, one creating art in seclusion, the other creating chaos in public. Victims of Conway often described a moment of cognitive dissonance when the truth was revealed. They had vivid memories of discussing cinema with a genius. Reconciling those memories with the reality of a con man was a painful psychological process. Some refused to believe it at first, clinging to the signed napkins and scraps of paper that Conway had given them. These artifacts became worthless souvenirs of a meeting that never really happened. The realization was a harsh lesson in skepticism. The locations where Conway operated became part of the lore. The specific tables at Joe Allen Restaurant or the bar stools in Soho clubs where he held court are remembered by those who were there. Staff at these establishments often played along or were equally duped. The imposter became a fixture of the scene, a character in the nightly drama of London nightlife. He was a ghost story, told by bartenders and patrons, like a legend that grew with every retelling. Anthony Fruin, the assistant who chased Conway for years later, reflected on the strange intimacy of the investigation. He knew more about Conway's movements than he did about some of his own friends. Tracking the imposter became a personal mission to protect Kubrick's reputation. Yet there was also a sense of pity. Conway was a man desperate to be someone else, anyone else other than himself. The sadness of that existence was not lost on those who hunted him. The deception also highlighted the hierarchical nature of the film industry. People were terrified to question Conway because they feared offending a powerful director. The power dynamic silenced their doubts. If a famous director says he is casting a movie, you do not ask for his identification. You listen and you hope. Conway understood this dynamic instinctively. He wielded the authority of the Kubrick name like a weapon, using it to silence skepticism and demand compliance. There were moments when the con almost fell apart. People who knew the real Kubrick or had met him briefly would cross paths with Conway. In those moments, Conway would improvise, wildly claiming he had had plastic surgery or that he was wearing a disguise to avoid the press. His quick thinking and absolute commitment to the lie usually saved him. He was a master of gaslighting, convincing people that their own eyes were deceiving them. The phenomenon of the confidence man is a staple of true crime, but Conway belongs to a unique category. He did not murder, and his financial gains were relatively small compared to major fraudsters. His crime was theft of identity and abuse of trust. He stole the reputation of a living legend and wore it like a cheap suit. The violation was metaphysical as much as it was criminal. He tarnished the name of an artist who valued perfection above all else. In the end, the story of Alan Conway serves as a cautionary tale about the allure of fame. It exposes the fragility of truth in a society driven by image. We want to believe in magic, and we want to touch the hem of the garment of greatness. Conway offered that experience for the price of a dinner or a drink. For a brief moment, his victims felt special, chosen, and seen. That feeling was the drug he sold, and business was always good. The real Stanley Kubrick died in March 1999, leaving behind a legacy that no imposter could ever touch. His films remain timeless monuments to his genius. Alan Conway died months earlier, leaving behind a legacy of confusion and bemusement. The two men never met, yet their lives are forever linked in this strange narrative. One was the creator of worlds, the other was a pretender who lived in a world of his own making. As we reflect on this case, we are left with a lingering question. If a man can convince the world he is someone else simply by saying so, what does that say about our own perceptions? We rely on surface-level cues to judge reality. We trust names, titles, and confident assertions. Alan Conway showed us the cracks in that foundation. He walked through the world as a living fiction, and for a time the world believed him. Today, the legend of the Kubrick imposter is a cult story known to film buffs and true crime enthusiasts. It stands as a testament to the power of belief and the audacity of the human spirit, however misguided. The next time you meet someone famous in a bar and they promise you the world, take a closer look. It might just be a travel agent from London looking for a free drink and a moment in the spotlight. Ultimately, the man who impersonated a famous film director remains a fascinating character study. He was a villain to some, a tragic figure to others, and a source of entertainment to many. He proved that with enough confidence you can be anyone you want to be, at least for a little while. And in the dark corners of a London pub, the ghost of his performance still lingers, reminding us that things are not always what they seem.